The sugar from this plantation was said to be the purest in Europe. It was so white that it erased any memory of where it came from. But at night, the fields did not smell sweet. They smelled of iron, sweat, and rot. Every time a person vanished into the mill or fell into boiling syrup, the harvest grew heavier. Stalks thickened, juice darkened, crystals whitened as if bleached by bones. People learned quickly, the land did not take at random. It chose. And the more it was fed, the sweeter the sugar became. Then the plantation burned, the masters disappeared, but the earth remained. And it still remembers what it was fed. The sugar did not smell sweet when it was crushed. It rose from the mill in a warm, choking breath that coated the tongue with metal and rot, a scent closer to wet iron than to anything meant for a table. At dawn, when the first carts lurched toward the presses, their wooden wheels were already darkened, sticky with a residue that clung and stretched like coagulating blood. The air vibrated with insects that refused to land, and birds skirted the fields in wide, nervous arcs, as if the ground below had learned how to bite. The cane stood unnaturally straight, pale stalks packed so tightly they formed walls rather than rows. When the wind passed through them, it did not hiss or rustle but whispered, a dry, rasping sound that seemed to move with intention. Leaves brushed together like fingers rehearsing a task, and those forced to cut them felt watched, measured, weighed by something beneath their feet. The soil was black and heavy, slick even in the dry season, and it exhaled heat long after sunset, a breath that smelled of sweat, decay, and something older that had no name. By day, the plantation gleamed. Lime-washed buildings caught the sun and threw it back in blinding sheets, and the refinery was scrubbed until its walls shone brighter than any chapel across the ocean. Overseers spoke of purity and perfection, of sugar so white it erased the memory of where it came from. By night, the illusion collapsed. Heat pressed the air flat against the skin, and the ground seemed to pulse, as if something deep below were working alongside the living, grinding and kneading in the dark. Those bound to the fields learned quickly that the land listened. When exhaustion tipped a body into the path of a blade, when a foot slipped into the rollers, when someone did not rise after collapsing between the rows, the cane responded. Stalks thickened. Juice ran richer. The crystals that formed days later were finer, brighter, almost luminous. Accidents were followed by abundance, and abundance by silence, the absence of a name that no one dared to speak aloud. Hammocks emptied without ceremony. Tools were left where hands had dropped them. The earth accepted everything without sound, drawing it down through roots and stones, breaking bone and muscle into something usable. Beneath the fields, crushed remains accumulated and dissolved, feeding the cane not just water and minerals, but memory, fear, and the last heat of living bodies. The plantation did not merely grow sugar. It refined suffering, bleaching it until it looked like wealth, until it could be piled into sacks and shipped across the sea, spotless and desirable, carrying with it the quiet knowledge that the sweeter it tasted, the more the land had been fed. The plantation rose like a white cathedral planted deliberately in corruption, its geometry too precise, its brightness too violent for the land that held it. The refinery dominated everything, a mass of stone and lime wash scrubbed daily until the walls gleamed with an almost sacred intensity. Sunlight struck its surfaces and fractured, blinding anyone who looked too long, forcing eyes downward toward the cane fields where the real work was done. From a distance, it appeared immaculate, an argument made of architecture that order had conquered chaos, that discipline had purified the tropics into something productive and obedient. By day, this illusion held. Overseers walked the grounds in clean coats that never seemed to stain, their boots polished, their ledgers neat and dry. They spoke of refinement as if it were a moral act, of crystals so perfect they could rival snow untouched by human hands. The sugar was displayed proudly in shallow trays, pale and glittering, each grain catching light like ground glass. Visitors from across the sea marveled at its whiteness, at how thoroughly all trace of origin had been erased. No one spoke of the soil. No one inhaled deeply enough to notice what lingered beneath the sweetness. The refinery itself was a place of constant, grinding motion. Wheels turned, presses screamed, and steam rose in thick, choking clouds that coated skin and lungs alike. Inside, the air was heavy with heat and moisture, a suffocating presence that made breathing a conscious effort. The walls sweated. The floor remained slick no matter how often it was scrubbed, stained dark in places where spills had soaked too deeply to be removed. Workers moved through this space like shadows, bodies bent and slick with perspiration, their movements reduced to repetition until they became extensions of the machinery itself. As the sun fell and the white walls cooled, the plantation changed character. The brilliance dulled into a chalky pallor, and the refinery's clean lines softened into something skeletal. Heat refused to leave. It pressed the air flat against skin and bone, turning each breath into labor. The ground, denied rest, began its own work. From the fields rose a stench that thickened with each passing hour, a layered odor of sweat, crushed vegetation, rot, and old blood baked deep into the soil. It was not the sharp smell of fresh death, but something heavier, seasoned, the aroma of things broken down and reused. The cane fields at night were nearly unbearable. Rows that appeared orderly by day became oppressive corridors in the dark, the stalks towering and closing in, leaves slicing its skin with careless intimacy. The soil beneath remained warm, almost feverish, as if it retained the memory of bodies pressed against it. Those who walked there felt vibrations through their feet, subtle and persistent, like the distant turning of an unseen engine. The earth exhaled slowly, rhythmically, as though keeping time with the mill even after its wheels slowed. Superstition did not arrive suddenly. It crept in through observation. Patterns emerged that no one could ignore. After certain nights, when the mill screamed longer than usual, when exhaustion tipped someone past the point of recovery, the next days brought abundance. Cane thickened and sweetened. Juice flowed darker, richer. The sugar that crystallized afterward was purer than before, its whiteness almost luminous, as if light itself had been trapped inside it. Loss and gain became linked by a logic that required no explanation, only acknowledgement. The overseers dismissed these thoughts publicly, but their records betrayed them. In neat columns, yields increased in direct correspondence with attrition. Empty hammocks appeared in the margins of ledgers as faint notations, quickly crossed out or absorbed into totals. The land was rewarded, and reward demanded continuation. Fields were expanded. Hours lengthened. Pressure increased, not just on bodies, but on the fragile boundary between accident and intention. Beneath the surface, the soil grew dense and rich, fed by more than decaying plant matter. Roots wrapped around fragments of bone ground smooth by time, drawing from them whatever essence remained. The cane thrived on this invisible nourishment, drinking deeply from a history pressed into the earth layer by layer. Each harvest pulled more from below, extracting not just sugar but the residue of lives reduced to fertilizer. The plantation became an organism unto itself, refinery and field connected by an unspoken circulation of sacrifice and reward. The owner rarely visited the fields at night, yet even within the great house the effects were felt. Floors creaked with unfamiliar insistence. Air moved without wind. A faint metallic tang seeped into chambers meant to be insulated from labor and heat. Sleep came poorly, interrupted by dreams of endless rows and crushing wheels, of whiteness spreading until it consumed everything. The plantation did not respect walls. It extended its influence outward, demanding recognition even from those who believed themselves separate from its work. By the time dawn returned and the white walls caught the sun once more, the night's stench retreated but did not vanish. It settled into fabric, into hair, into the pores of stone itself. The refinery resumed its performance of purity, and the sugar sparkled as convincingly as ever. Yet beneath the brightness lay a certainty no amount of scrubbing could erase. The plantation was alive in a way no one wished to name, sustained by an exchange older than any ledger, and every flawless crystal carried within it the quiet knowledge that the land did not give without first taking something in return. The enslaved learned the rhythm not through stories, but through repetition. It revealed itself in patterns carved into muscle and memory, in the way the fields responded after certain nights, and how the cane seemed to listen. When a body vanished into the mill, swallowed by gears that did not slow, the land reacted. When a foot slipped beneath a blade slick with juice and blood, when exhaustion bent a spine too far forward and a body pitched into boiling syrup, the fields answered with growth. The next harvest always came heavier. The cane stood thicker, its stalks swollen and tense, its leaves sharper, more aggressive. Juice ran darker and richer, coating the hands with a sticky film that resisted washing. The sugar that followed hardened whiter than before, fine as ash, bright as bone polished by time. At first, it was whispered as coincidence. Heat caused mistakes. Fatigue led to carelessness. The mill was unforgiving, but coincidence repeated too cleanly. Loss aligned too precisely with abundance. The land did not respond to storms or seasons with the same enthusiasm it showed for collapse. It responded to flesh. Superstition crept in through silence, through the spaces left by those who did not return to the hammocks at night. It hardened into certainty as the years passed, and the pattern held, unbroken and precise. The soil itself felt different beneath bare feet. It clung, resisting each step, warm even before the sun rose. Digging into it revealed layers dense and dark, packed tight with more than root and stone. Tools struck resistance that was not rock, dull thuds beneath the surface that were quickly covered and ignored. The earth accepted everything pressed into it, drawing bodies downward, breaking them apart slowly, patiently, until nothing remained recognizable. The cane drank deeply from this hidden richness, its roots coiling greedily around whatever they found. The land did not take at random. This truth settled heavily over the fields. The tired were marked first, bodies already frayed by long days and short nights. The sick followed, lungs weak, limbs trembling, skin too thin to hold in heat. The defiant did not last long either. Those who slowed, who resisted, who let their eyes linger too long on the horizon, were claimed with unsettling efficiency. Accidents found them. The blade slipped. The footing gave way. The mill pulled harder. Each loss was absorbed without pause, folded seamlessly into the cycle of work and reward. Fear reshaped behavior. Movements became careful but never slow, precise but drained of resistance. I stayed lowered. Breath was measured. Yet no amount of caution offered safety. The land's appetite was patient and selective, and it did not require consent. Even those who followed every rule felt its attention pass over them like a hand hovering just above the skin, testing, weighing. Survival became temporary, a delay rather than a victory. Night intensified everything. The fields held heat and sound, amplifying every rustle and breath. The cane whispered constantly, leaves brushing together in patterns that felt deliberate, rehearsed. The soil exhaled steadily, releasing the day's absorbed heat along with its deeper scents. Sweat soaked into the ground and did not evaporate. It joined what was already there, feeding something unseen but present. Sleep came in fragments, interrupted by dreams of sinking, of pressure closing in from all sides, of roots tightening around bone. The mill at night became a mouth that never fully closed. Even when the wheels slowed, the structure creaked and sighed, metal contracting and expanding with temperature changes that sounded uncomfortably like breath. Those forced to work the late hours felt watched by the machinery itself, as though it recognized familiarity, as though it remembered those it had already taken. The floor vibrated faintly, carrying echoes of past movements, past struggles, past endings that had been absorbed into the rhythm of production. Superstition was no longer confined to whispers. It shaped the way bodies were moved, the way injuries were treated, the way exhaustion was concealed. Illness was hidden as long as possible. Weakness was masked. The sick were pushed to work harder in a desperate attempt to outrun selection. It rarely worked. The land did not need urgency. It waited. Overseers noticed the changes without naming them. Yields rose predictably after periods of increased attrition. The ledgers reflected this with cold clarity. Numbers climbed. Profits expanded. Fields were pushed further, carved deeper into the island's interior, as though the plantation were spreading its roots outward in search of more to consume. Pressure increased accordingly. The cycle accelerated. The enslaved began to recognize moments of danger not by instruction, but by instinct. Certain days felt heavier from the start. The air pressed down harder. The cane seemed closer, more crowded. Tools felt unbalanced in the hand. On those days, accidents clustered. The land took more than usual, and the harvest that followed was always exceptional. Sugar from those periods carried a strange quality. It sparkled unnaturally, its whiteness almost luminous, its texture finer than anything that came before. It dissolved cleanly, leaving no residue, as if all impurity had already been removed at a far greater cost. The weight of this knowledge did not bring control. It brought dread. Certainty replaced hope. The understanding that survival was conditional, temporary, and largely out of one's own hands pressed down harder than exhaustion. The plantation functioned not as a workplace, but as a system of exchange, one that demanded bodies in return for abundance. The land enforced this balance with absolute indifference. Even those spared by chance felt altered. Muscles carried a constant tension. Sleep offered no rest. The sense of being measured never faded. Every step through the fields felt provisional, as though the soil were deciding, even now, whether to release or to pull downward. The plantation had taught its rhythm thoroughly, and it did not need to explain itself. It only needed time, patience, and the steady certainty that there would always be another harvest and another body to ensure it. The owner kept meticulous records, and in those pages the plantation existed as a triumph of reason. Yields were charted with careful precision, rainfall measured and compared, wind patterns noted in the margins as though the sky itself were a variable to be disciplined. Ink moved cleanly across paper, forming columns that rose steadily year after year. Absences were not recorded in the same way. Empty hammocks appeared briefly as irregularities, then vanished from the page entirely, their former occupants absorbed into adjusted totals and revised expectations. The ledgers remained balanced. The books never screamed. Expansion followed success as naturally as breath. New fields were cut from the island's interior, trees felled and burned until smoke hung low over the land for weeks, soaking into skin and cloth. The earth was opened deeper each season, plows biting further down, exposing layers that had not seen light in centuries. What emerged was darker, heavier soil that clung to tools and resisted being shaken loose, dense with a richness that promised reward. The cane responded immediately. It surged upward with aggressive vitality, stalks thickening, leaves lengthening, roots driving downward with renewed hunger. Longer hours were ordered to match the growth. Days stretched past exhaustion into something flatter and more dangerous, where mistakes multiplied and bodies failed without warning. The mill ran hotter, louder, its rhythm tightening until it felt inevitable. The owner rarely visited during these hours, preferring instead to review his records by lamplight, satisfied by the steady ascent of numbers that justified every decision. Profit became proof. The plantation, as represented on paper, was flawless. Beneath the fields, unseen and unacknowledged, accumulation continued. Bones crushed under centuries of pressure and weight were ground finer each year by root and stone. Muscle and sinew broke down into a paste the soil absorbed eagerly. Memory itself seemed to leach downward, pressed out of flesh and into the earth, where it lingered without shape or voice. The cane drank deeply from this mixture. Its growth carried a density that could not be explained by climate alone. Each stalk held more than sap. It held residue. Those forced to work the fields felt this transformation in subtle ways. Tools vibrated differently when they struck the ground. Digging produced a resistance that was neither stone nor clay, a yielding firmness that felt disturbingly organic. Occasionally, fragments surfaced that could not be mistaken for anything else, pale and smooth, quickly buried again with averted eyes. The earth did not relinquish what it had claimed. It incorporated it. The owner took pride in innovation. Drainage systems were carved to control water flow, channels cutting through soil already heavy with unseen content. These cuts exposed deeper layers, releasing odors long sealed away. The air near the trenches grew thick and metallic, a scent that lingered even after the earth was packed back into place. The cane planted along these channels flourished disproportionately, growing taller and sweeter than the rest. This was noted with approval and quietly replicated. Pressure increased as success compounded. More land demanded more labor. Replacement arrived in shipments, bodies unfamiliar with the rhythms of the place, unprepared for the way the ground itself seemed to watch and wait. They learned quickly, or they did not last long. The plantation adapted to each loss seamlessly. The system required no pause for grief. It absorbed everything and continued. The great house reflected this order in miniature. Floors were polished, walls adorned with maps and charts that transformed the island into something legible and owned. From its windows, the fields appeared orderly, productive, obedient. The scent of sugar drifted upward on warm days, masking everything beneath it. At night, however, the illusion weakened. Heat rose from the ground and pressed against the structure, seeping through stone and wood. A faint tang crept into the rooms, metallic and sour, impossible to fully ignore. Sleep was restless, disturbed by dreams of endless rows and pressure without release. The owner dismissed these sensations as the cost of the climate. He trusted his records more than his senses. They told him the plantation was thriving, that his methods were sound, that the land rewarded discipline and investment. He did not consider that the soil might be responding to something else entirely, that it might have learned a preference that aligned conveniently with his ambitions. Each season reinforced this belief. Profits swelled. The sugar refined finer, its whiteness approaching something unnatural. Buyers praised its quality, its purity, unaware or unwilling to ask how such perfection was achieved. The plantation's reputation spread across the sea, its product desired precisely because it revealed nothing of its origin. The land had learned to erase its own violence, to transmute it into something clean and marketable, yet the cost accumulated regardless of acknowledgement. Beneath the roots, the concentration of crushed remains thickened the soil until it felt almost alive. Roots twisted through it with purpose, drawing up more than nutrients. The cane grew heavier, denser, its fibers tight and unyielding. Cutting it became harder work each year, blades dulling faster, arms aching deeper. The land demanded effort proportional to what it gave. There were moments, brief and easily dismissed, when the owner sensed imbalance. A ledger page felt heavier in the hand. A number failed to bring satisfaction. These thoughts passed quickly, overridden by the clarity of success. The plantation did not encourage introspection. It rewarded momentum. Those who worked closest to the earth felt the change more acutely. Kneeling in the fields, they sensed a pull downward, a subtle pressure that made standing feel temporary. The ground retained heat unnaturally, radiating it upward even after weeks without sun. Rain soaked in and did not cool it. The soil had become a reservoir, storing not just warmth but everything pressed into it over years of cultivation and loss. By the time the owner ordered yet another expansion, cutting into land previously left untouched, the pattern was complete. Bones beneath the roots were no longer isolated remnants, but part of a continuous layer, finely ground and evenly distributed. The cane drank this legacy without distinction, incorporating it into every fiber. Water alone no longer explained its growth. The plantation had become a closed system, recycling flesh into profit with ruthless efficiency. On paper, it was a masterpiece of management. In reality, it was something else entirely. The land no longer required instruction. It had learned what it needed, and it responded faithfully to the only offering ever made to it. The owner, reviewing his records with satisfaction, never noticed that the soil no longer merely supported the plantation. It sustained it, demanded it, and would not allow it to exist any other way. One season, the exchange faltered. The island passed through months without epidemic, without storms violent enough to break bodies at scale. Fevers burned out quickly, wounds closed. The exhausted still labored, but fewer collapsed in ways the land seemed to recognize. The mill screamed and pressed as always, yet it was fed only cane and sweat, not the deeper offering it had come to expect. When harvest came, the change was unmistakable. Cane stalks were thinner, their fibers coarse. Juice ran pale, watery, lacking the density that had become familiar. The sugar that formed from it crystallized unevenly, grains dull and gray, brittle under the fingers, imperfect in a way no amount of refinement could hide. The refinery responded with silence at first. Then the ledgers betrayed anxiety. Columns failed to rise. Margins tightened. Buyers complained, quietly at first, then with sharpened interest. The owner walked the floors longer at night, rereading figures that refused to correct themselves. The plantation felt slack, underfed, as though some vital conduit had been closed. The soil retained its heat, but the air above the fields lacked its usual weight. The cane whispered less. Something was missing, and everyone felt it without naming it. Panic spread not as noise, but as pressure. Orders lengthened the day by small increments that accumulated into something crushing. Rest narrowed. Pace increased. The fields became sites of relentless motion, bodies pushed beyond endurance not by cruelty alone, but by desperation. The land was being asked to give without receiving, and it resisted. Tools dulled faster. Muscles failed sooner. Fatigue became the dominant condition, flattening thought and reducing movement to instinct. The mill was driven harder, its wheels turning longer into the night. Heat built to intolerable levels. Steam thickened until it pressed against lungs like wet cloth. Floors slicked with syrup and residue grew treacherous. Hands slipped. Footing failed. The line between accident and inevitability blurred. It did not take long. The plantation had always known how to correct imbalance. The system only needed sufficient force applied to fragile bodies already frayed thin. Collapse returned suddenly, violently, as if summoned. A worker pitched forward into the rollers, machinery grabbing and refusing to release. Another fell into boiling syrup, the surface breaking and closing again without pause. Exhaustion claimed more before dawn, bodies folding where they stood, heat and pressure doing what illness had not. The mill swallowed flesh once more, and this time it did not hesitate. Its rhythm tightened, satisfied, the vibration deepening as though it had remembered itself. The fields responded immediately. Cane surged upward with renewed aggression, stalks thickening in days rather than weeks. Leaves sharpened. Roots drove deeper, twisting through soil that welcomed them. Juice darkened, flowing heavy and rich. When the sugar crystallized again, it bloomed white, blinding in its purity, fine as powder, flawless to the point of obscenity. It lay in trays like fresh snow spread over a grave, pristine and silent, daring anyone to ask what it had cost. Relief followed quickly, indistinguishable from horror. The plantation exhaled. Ledgers corrected themselves. Buyers praised the return to form. The owner resumed his confidence, interpreting the reversal as proof of discipline restored. He did not question why recovery required collapse, why abundance followed only after loss. The land had taught its lesson thoroughly. The estate obeyed. Those who remained felt the shift more deeply. The soil seemed heavier, more insistent beneath their feet. The air thickened again at night, pressing against skin and bone. The cane resumed its whispering, leaves brushing together with renewed intensity. The sense of being watched returned, stronger than before, as though the land had grown impatient with the interruption and now monitored more closely for future lapses. The pattern was no longer accidental. It had been confirmed. The plantation had learned what deprivation felt like, and it responded with appetite. Balance was not maintained through care or restraint, but through enforced loss. Bodies became the corrective mechanism, applied whenever yields threatened to fall. The system required vigilance, pressure, and a willingness to let collapse happen where it was most effective. In the aftermath, exhaustion deepened into something more permanent. Movement slowed not from resistance, but from depletion. Fear lost its sharp edge and settled into a constant ache. Survival resumed its provisional nature. No one believed in reprieve anymore. The plantation had demonstrated its needs with unmistakable clarity, and it would not tolerate neglect. The land itself seemed altered by the interruption and its correction. Soil compacted further, dense and warm, holding on to heat and memory alike. Digging into it released stronger odors, metallic and sweet in equal measure. Roots of surfaced fragments ground too fine to identify, pale dust clinging to moisture. The cane drank this eagerly, growing heavier still, demanding more effort to cut, more strength to process. By the time the season closed, the lesson had been absorbed at every level. Productivity depended on sacrifice. Abundance followed collapse. The mill did not simply process cane. It regulated the exchange, correcting deficits with brutal efficiency. The sugar that left the island carried no trace of this understanding, its whiteness complete, its surface immaculate. But within the plantation, no one mistook its purity for innocence again. The land had been denied briefly and had responded by tightening its grip. It would not allow another season of restraint. From that point forward, pressure would not ease until something gave, and something always did. The plantation had rediscovered its balance, and it rested not on weather or labor alone, but on the certainty that when sweetness dulled, flesh would be provided, and the earth would once again be satisfied. Years later, after rebellion and fire erased the plantation from the surface of the island, the land was left alone. Walls collapsed inward and blackened beams sank into ash. The refinery roof fell last, folding in on itself with a groan that echoed through the hills, and then disappeared, swallowed by vines and time. Rain came and washed soot into the ground. Wind scattered what could still burn. Silence settled slowly, not as absence, but as a waiting state, as though the earth were holding its breath. No one rebuilt there. The place was marked not by fences or warnings, but by refusal, an instinctive avoidance that passed from mouth to mouth without explanation. The fields did not stay empty. Cane returned first, wild and unpruned, rising where rows had once been measured and enforced. It grew thicker than elsewhere on the island, its stalks pale and heavy, leaves sharp enough to draw blood from careless hands. The soil beneath it remained dark and warm, resisting cooling even after storms. Rainwater soaked in and vanished quickly, pulled downward as though claimed. At night, the ground released heat in slow pulses, and the air above it trembled faintly, the way it had when the mill still turned. Travelers sometimes passed near the ruins, drawn by curiosity or hunger. The wild cane looked inviting, its sweetness promised by scent alone. Those who cut it noticed how easily the blade slid through, how the stalks seemed to yield willingly. The juice tasted intense, almost overwhelming, sweetness blooming immediately on the tongue. It never lasted. Nausea followed within moments, a clenching deep in the stomach, a heaviness that spread upward into the chest. Breathing became labor. The sweetness curdled into something metallic and sour, lingering long after the mouth was rinsed. Some described a pressure from below, a sensation of weight rising through the soles of the feet, as though the ground were leaning upward in response to being disturbed. Others felt watched, not from the surrounding brush, but from beneath the soil itself. The feeling was not sharp fear, but something steadier, a calm certainty that attention had been drawn and would not easily be released. Those who lingered too long reported dizziness, trembling, and dreams that pressed against waking, images of endless rows and crushing heat that did not belong to their own memories. The ruins resisted decay in strange ways. Bones of buildings remained intact long after nearby structures had collapsed entirely. Stone foundations stayed warm to the touch even at dawn. Digging near them revealed soil compacted to an unnatural density, dark and slick, exhaling a faint metallic odor when disturbed. Roots coiled thickly through it, intertwining with fragments ground too fine to identify. The land had not emptied itself with fire. It had absorbed everything and settled. Animals avoided the place. Grazers skirted its edges, refusing to cross invisible boundaries. Birds passed overhead but did not land. Insects swarmed briefly and then vanished. The silence that replaced them felt deliberate, enforced. At night, wind moving through the wild cane produced a whispering sound that carried far, dry and rhythmic, eerily consistent. Those who heard it from a distance felt an inexplicable urge to walk closer, to step into the fields and listen more carefully, as though the sound contained something unfinished. Time did not soften the effect. Decades passed, and the land remained unchanged. Stories accumulated instead. Some claimed the soil demanded remembrance, that it rejected those who treated it as empty ground. Others insisted it was cursed, poisoned by blood and fire. None fully explained the persistence of the sensation that the place was not abandoned, but merely unsupervised. The plantation had vanished, but the system it had enforced had not been dismantled. It had sunk into the earth and continued quietly. Occasionally, someone did not return from the ruins. There were no signs of violence, no traces left behind beyond a path that ended abruptly at the edge of the cane. Searchers felt the same pressure, the same unease, and turned back before stepping fully into the fields. The ground offered no answers. It held everything it took. The sweetness of the wild cane became a warning rather than an invitation. Those who tasted it learned quickly that the land still practiced exchange. It gave generously at first, then demanded payment in ways that were difficult to name. Illness followed some encounters. Others carried the effects longer, a persistent tightness in the chest, a sense of being pulled backward when they tried to leave the island entirely. The land did not pursue. It waited. What remained was not a haunting in the familiar sense. There were no voices, no apparitions rising from the ruins. The horror lay in continuity. The soil had learned hunger, had been taught carefully and repeatedly what sustained it best. Fire and rebellion had removed the masters, had broken the visible machinery of exploitation, but they had not starved the earth of its education. The ground remembered exactly how to be fed. Sugar no longer left the island from that place. No ledgers recorded yields. No ships waited at the coast. Yet the cycle persisted in miniature, self-contained and patient. Roots drew up whatever remained below. Cane thickened and sweetened. The land maintained itself on what it had absorbed, preserving the logic of exchange without witnesses. Those who passed near the ruins felt anger as often as fear, a deep, unsettled fury without a clear target. Others felt sorrow, so heavy it made standing difficult. The place provoked reaction because it refused closure. It did not allow the past to become inert. It insisted on presence. In the end, the land was not cursed because of what had happened there. It was altered. It had been trained to respond to suffering with abundance, to convert collapse into nourishment. That lesson could not be unlearned. The plantation had been erased, but its function had been perfected and embedded far below the reach of fire or revolt. The island endured, vibrant and living around it, but the ruins remained a dark node in its body, a place where sweetness and sickness were inseparable. Those who understood avoided it. Those who did not sometimes fed it unknowingly. And the earth, patient and exacting, continued to remember, holding its knowledge beneath layers of warm, dark soil, waiting without urgency for the next disturbance, certain that hunger, once taught, never truly fades.